In the silent desert of southern Iraq, beneath layers of sand that have witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, clay tablets have waited for millennia to share their secrets. These tablets, pressed with wedge-shaped marks by scribes who lived before the pyramids rose from Egypt's plains, speak of beings called the Anunnaki, those who came from heaven to earth. Among the thousands of translated texts, certain passages have puzzled researchers for generations. References to afflictions that struck only specific families, illnesses that seem to follow bloodlines through generations. Tonight, we journey into the earliest written records of human civilization, exploring the mysterious connection between ancient Sumerian medicine, divine intervention, and the haunting possibility that some diseases were never meant to be random at all. The sun descends toward the western horizon and paints the Iraqi desert in shades of amber and rose, its light catching the slow-moving waters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers as they wind their ancient paths through a landscape that has witnessed more history than any other place on Earth. Here in the land once called Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, the air grows cool as evening approaches, and shadows lengthen across strange mounds that rise from the flat terrain. Mounds that are not natural hills, but the buried remains of cities that flourished when much of the world still slumbered in prehistory. If you were to stand here as the light fades, listening to the whisper of wind across the sand, you might feel something stirring beneath your feet, something patient and waiting, something that has waited for 5,000 years to share its secrets with those willing to listen. This is the cradle of civilization, the place where humanity first learned to plant crops in orderly rows, to build cities of mud brick that reached toward the sky, to organize society into complex hierarchies of priests and kings and merchants and farmers, and, most importantly, to write. The Sumerians called their land Kengir, the civilized land, and they called themselves the black-headed people, a reference perhaps to their dark hair that distinguished them from neighboring tribes. They emerged seemingly from nowhere around 4,500 BCE, settling in the southern regions of what is now Iraq. And within centuries, they had created something unprecedented in human experience. A network of city-states connected by trade and religion, governed by laws written on clay, populated by people who believed themselves to be the caretakers of divine knowledge. The geography itself seemed designed by Providence to nurture civilization, for the two great rivers provided water for irrigation, fish for protein, reeds for building, and clay, endless abundant clay that could be shaped into bricks for homes or flattened into tablets for writing. The soil between the rivers, enriched each year by flooding, yielded barley and wheat and dates in quantities sufficient to support populations that numbered in the tens of thousands, leaving some members of society free to pursue activities other than farming. Activities like astronomy and mathematics and medicine, and the recording of stories that would outlast empires. As darkness settles over the land tonight, imagine time itself beginning to flow backwards, the centuries peeling away like layers of sediment, the modern world fading and the ancient world emerging from beneath the sand. The highways disappear and are replaced by dusty tracks. The distant glow of electric lights gives way to oil lamps and torches, and where now there is silence and emptiness. Great cities rise with their temples and marketplaces, their streets busy with merchants and priests, their scribal schools echoing with the voices of young men learning the complex art of cuneiform writing. This is the world that created the tablets we will explore tonight. Tablets that speak of gods who walked among mortals, of divine interventions in human affairs, of knowledge both given and withheld, and perhaps of afflictions designed to follow certain families through generations. In the cities of Nippur and Ur and Eridu and Uruk, in temple complexes that served as centers of learning as well as worship, scribes sat cross-legged in courtyards and small rooms, pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay with reed styluses, recording everything from grain shipments to epic poems, from mathematical calculations to medical diagnoses, from hymns of praise to lamentations of loss. They could not have known that these humble clay tablets, baked hard by the Mesopotamian sun, or sometimes deliberately fired in kilns, would survive conquest and destruction and the slow grinding of millennia to reach us in the present day. Fragile messengers from the dawn of history, carrying words that have waited longer than any other written words on earth to be read again. The great libraries of the ancient Near East, the archives of Nippur and Ur, and the later Assyrian collection at Nineveh contained tens of thousands of these tablets organized by subject matter in ways that would be familiar to any modern librarian. There were shelves, or more accurately clay storage vessels and woven baskets, dedicated to administrative records, receipts for grain, contracts for sale of land, accounts of temple offerings, lists of workers and their wages. Other sections held literary texts, the great myths of creation and flood, the epic adventures of kings like Gilgamesh, the descent of the goddess Inanna to the underworld, the hymns praising the gods and lamenting the destruction of cities. Still other tablets recorded what we would now call scientific knowledge. Astronomical observations tracking the movements of planets across the night sky, mathematical tables for multiplication and division and the calculation of areas and volumes, and medical texts describing symptoms and treatments for ailments that afflicted the people of ancient Sumer, just as similar ailments afflict us today. When archaeologists of the 19th and 20th centuries began excavating these sites, they found tablets in quantities that staggered the imagination, so many that museums around the world are still cataloguing and translating pieces that were unearthed over 100 years ago. The work of translation is painstaking and slow, requiring not only knowledge of the cuneiform script and the Sumerian language, which is related to no other known language on Earth, but also understanding of the cultural context in which these texts were created. Pioneers like Samuel Noah Kramer, whose book History Begins at Sumer introduced generations of readers to this ancient civilization, and Thorkild Jacobsen, whose sensitive translations captured the poetry and power of Sumerian literature, dedicated their lives to making these voices from the distant past audible again. Yet, for all their work and the work of scholars who followed, many tablets remain controversial or poorly understood, their meanings debated, their implications sometimes uncomfortable for those who prefer their ancient history to fit into neat categories. Among the literary and administrative and scientific texts, there are passages that speak of things the scholars do not quite know how to classify. References to divine knowledge that was given to certain humans but forbidden to others. Descriptions of afflictions that seem to target families rather than individuals. Rituals designed to break curses that follow bloodlines through generations. And, above all, accounts of the Anunnaki. those powerful beings who the Sumerians believed had created humanity, and who retained the power to bless or curse their creation according to purposes that mortals could not always understand. To understand these mysterious passages, we must first understand the world of the scribes who wrote them. For writing was not a casual skill in ancient Sumer, but a sacred trust that carried with it both privilege and responsibility. Young men destined for the scribal profession, for it was almost exclusively men who learned to write, began their training at the Adaba, which means tablet house in Sumerian, usually around the age of 7 or 8. There they would spend years learning first to form the wedge-shaped marks that gave cuneiform its name, then to combine these marks into the hundreds of signs that represented words and syllables, then to read and copy texts of increasing complexity. The training was rigorous and sometimes harsh, with students who made errors facing physical punishment. But those who completed it emerged as members of an elite class, educated men who could serve in temples and palaces, who could record the transactions of merchants and the decrees of kings, and who could read and copy the sacred texts that told of the origins of the world and the nature of the gods. The scribes understood that they were custodians of knowledge, and they took this responsibility seriously, copying texts faithfully from generation to generation so that the wisdom of the past would not be lost to the future. Yet, not all knowledge was treated equally. Some texts were meant for general circulation, available to anyone who could read them, while others were marked as restricted, intended only for those who had been initiated into certain mysteries. The Sumerians believed that knowledge itself had divine origin, that the arts of civilization, from brewing beer to building temples to writing laws, had been given to humanity by the gods in the form of the me, a word that means something like divine decrees or cosmic powers, or perhaps blueprints for civilization. These me were not abstract concepts, but were believed to have a kind of physical reality, capable of being held and transferred, and even stolen, as in the famous myth where Inanna tricks the god Enki into giving her the me so she can bring them to her city of Uruk. If knowledge was divine and could be dangerous in the wrong hands, it made sense that certain knowledge should be protected, shared only among those prepared to receive it, recorded in ways that would preserve it without making it too accessible. This is the context in which we must understand the more mysterious tablets, the ones that speak of divine interventions in human bloodlines, or of afflictions designed by the gods to affect certain families, of secrets about human origins that perhaps were never meant to be widely known. The rivers themselves held deep meaning for the Sumerians, serving not only as the practical sources of water and transportation and fish, but also as symbols of divine power flowing through the earthly realm. The Tigris, which they called Idigna, was said to be swift and impetuous, while the Euphrates, the Buranun, was broader and more gentle, and both were believed to have their ultimate source in the Abzu, the primordial underground ocean of fresh water that lay beneath the earth. This Abzu was the domain of Enki, known later to the Babylonians as Ea, one of the most important and most complex of the Sumerian gods. Enki was the god of wisdom, magic, crafts and creation, and a trickster figure who nonetheless genuinely cared for humanity and often intervened to protect humans from the more severe punishments decreed by other gods. It was Enki who was credited with designing human beings, working with the mother goddess to shape clay into living creatures. And it was Enki who would later warn the hero Ziusudra of the coming flood, allowing him to survive and preserve humanity when other gods wanted our species to perish entirely. The Abzu, where Enki dwelt, was not merely a physical location, but a source of all wisdom and creativity, a place where secrets were kept and from which knowledge could be dispensed to those the god deemed worthy. The Sumerians imagined their universe as layered, with the heavens above where the sky god ruled, the earth in the middle where humans lived, the Abzu beneath where Enki kept his wisdom, and the underworld still deeper where the dead went after dying. The gods moved freely between these realms, descending from heaven to walk among mortals, traveling to the underworld, and returning, sharing some of their knowledge with humanity while keeping other knowledge hidden. This was not a distant or abstract divine presence, but an immediate one, gods and humans interacting in ways that seem strange to modern sensibilities, but that were utterly real to the ancient Sumerians. The great temples called ziggurats that rose in every Sumerian city were believed to be actual meeting places between heaven and earth, stepped pyramids that the gods could descend and that priests could ascend, bridges between the mortal and divine realms. When the Sumerians recorded their myths and their medical texts and their astronomical observations, they were not engaging in speculation, but in documentation, writing down what they believed to be true accounts of how the world worked and who had made it work that way. As night falls completely over the land that was once Sumer, let us lift our eyes to the stars that are emerging from the darkening sky. These are the same stars that the Sumerian priests watched from the tops of their ziggurats, the same constellations they named and tracked across the months and years, the same celestial objects they believed to be the homes and manifestations of their gods. The Sumerians were devoted astronomers, recording the movements of the sun and moon and the 5 visible planets with precision that would not be surpassed for thousands of years, using their observations to create calendars and to predict eclipses and to seek omens about the future. They believed that the gods communicated through the sky, that the arrangement of the stars conveyed messages to those wise enough to read them, and that some of the divine beings they worshipped had come from those distant lights in the darkness above. Among all the beings in the Sumerian pantheon, none are more mysterious or more important for our exploration tonight than the Anunnaki. The word itself is usually translated as those who from heaven to earth came, or sometimes as princely offspring of An, referring to An the sky god, the father of all other deities. The Anunnaki were not a single god, but a group, sometimes described as the great gods collectively, sometimes as a specific set of powerful beings who played crucial roles in the creation and governance of the world. In some texts, they are judges of the underworld, weighing the deeds of the dead. In other texts, they are the senior gods who make great decisions about the fate of humanity. In still other texts, they are the beings who actually created humans, who designed our bodies and breathed life into clay, who established the conditions of mortal existence, including its limitations and its sufferings. What did the Anunnaki want from humanity? Why did they create us? What powers did they retain over their creation? These questions echo through the tablets that survived the millennia, and the answers suggested by those tablets are not always comfortable ones. Some texts speak of humanity created to serve the gods, to do the work that the lesser divine beings no longer wished to do, to tend the fields and build the temples and offer the sacrifices that the gods required. Other texts speak of humanity as beloved children, protected and guided by divine parents who wished the best for their creation. But other texts, rarer and more troubling, speak of divine regret over the creation of humanity, of gods who wished to destroy their creation, or to limit it, or to control it in ways that we might find disturbing. Among these troubling texts are references to afflictions and diseases that seem to have been designed rather than random, targeted rather than general, following bloodlines rather than striking at random. As we sit beneath these ancient stars, preparing to journey deeper into the mysteries preserved in clay, we must hold in our minds the world as the Sumerians understood it. A world where gods were real and present, where divine beings had created humanity for purposes we might not fully understand, where knowledge was power and some knowledge was too dangerous to share freely, where the blood that flowed in human veins carried traces of divine essence and might mark certain families for favor or for misfortune across generations. The tablets have waited so long to share their secrets. The night is deep now over Mesopotamia, and somewhere beneath the sand, in the buried libraries of cities whose very names were forgotten for millennia, those secrets remain inscribed in clay, patient and eternal, ready at last to speak to those who are willing to listen. In the beginning, before there was anything that could be called a beginning, there was only the mingling of waters and the darkness that preceded all things. And the Sumerians, who would one day press their memories into clay, understood this primordial moment as a time when the universe itself was still dreaming, still waiting to become what it would become. And from this formless expanse emerged the first separation, the first distinction, the cleaving of heaven from earth, which the ancients called An and Ki. And from their union came the great gods who would shape everything that followed. And chief among these were the ones the Sumerians called the Anunnaki, a name that scholars have translated in various ways, but which carries within it the essential meaning of those who from heaven to earth came, or perhaps more simply, the princely offspring of and the Sky Father. And these were not minor spirits or local deities, but rather the great powers who ordered the cosmos, who established the laws by which reality itself would operate. And at the head of this divine assembly sat An himself, the distant Sky Father who ruled but rarely intervened. And beneath him, Enlil, the Lord of the Wind, and the Word whose commands could not be countermanded, and Enki, the Wise One, the crafty one who dwelt in the sweet waters beneath the earth, and who knew secrets that even his fellow gods could not fathom, and Ninhursag, the Great Mother, the Lady of the Mountain who held the power of life itself within her hands. And around these four great powers gathered the rest of the Anunnaki, sometimes numbered at 50, sometimes at 7 times 50, depending on which tradition one follows. And beneath even these were the Igigi, the lesser gods, the workers of heaven, who performed the labor that kept the cosmos running, who dug the channels and tended the fields of the divine realm, who maintained the order that the greater gods had established, and for ages beyond counting this arrangement, held with the great gods ruling and deciding, and the lesser gods serving and laboring. But nothing lasts forever, not even in heaven. And the tablets tell us that in time, the Igigi grew weary of their endless toil, that they began to murmur among themselves about the unfairness of their lot, that their discontent grew and festered until it could no longer be contained. And so they did something unprecedented, something that shook the very foundations of the divine order. They rebelled, they threw down their tools, and they refused to work any longer. And this is where the story becomes most interesting for us, because faced with this crisis, the great gods gathered in council to determine what should be done. And it was Enki, the wise one, the keeper of secrets, who proposed a solution that would change everything. He suggested that they create a new being, a creature that would bear the burden of the gods, a worker who would till the soil and dig the canals and perform all the labor that the Igigi had abandoned, and the other gods agreed. And so began the most fateful project in the history of the cosmos. The creation of humanity, and the Atrahasis epic, which preserves this story in its most complete form, tells us exactly how this creation was accomplished. And the details are remarkable because they speak of a deliberate design process, a careful crafting of a new form of life. And the key ingredients were these: the clay of the earth, which would give the new creature its physical form, and the blood of a god which would give it life and intelligence and purpose. And some versions specify that this divine blood came from a god who was sacrificed for this purpose, a deity named Geshtu-i, whose name means ear or perhaps wisdom, and whose divine essence was mixed with the clay to create something entirely new. And Ninhursag, the mother goddess, shaped this mixture with her skilled hands, forming the first humans in her womb, according to some accounts, or upon the brick of birth, according to others. And Enki provided the wisdom, the specifications, the secret knowledge of how flesh and spirit should be joined, and together they brought forth humanity, not as an accident, not as an evolution, but as a deliberate creation designed for a specific purpose, to serve the gods, to tend the earth, to bear the burden that the lesser gods had refused. And this is worth pausing to consider, because if the Sumerians were correct, if their mythology preserves some memory of actual events, then humanity was created with intention. Created according to a design, created with divine components woven into our very being. And this means that our creators understood us in ways we might not understand ourselves. It means they knew our specifications, our capabilities, and perhaps also our vulnerabilities. And the humans they created were not quite like us. Not at first, because the tablets speak of the early generations as having lifespans that staggered the imagination. And this brings us to one of the most mysterious documents in all of ancient literature, the Sumerian king list, which records the rulers of the land from the time when kingship first descended from heaven, and the reigns attributed to those earliest kings are almost impossible to comprehend, with figures like Alulim of Eridu ruling for 28,800 years, and Enmenluana of Bad Tibira ruling for 43,200 years. And these numbers have puzzled scholars for generations, with some dismissing them as pure fantasy, and others suggesting they represent some different counting system, perhaps lunar months rather than solar years, and others still proposing that they preserve a memory, however distorted, of a time when human lifespans were genuinely different, when the divine blood that had been mixed into our creation still ran strong and pure. And during this antediluvian age, this time before the Great Flood, the boundaries between gods and humans seem to have been more permeable than they would later become. And various traditions speak of the gods walking among humans of divine beings, taking human partners of offspring who carried the blood of both realms within their veins. And these unions created bloodlines that were more than merely human lineages, that carried within them a greater portion of the divine essence that had been used in humanity's creation and some families. Some dynasties came to be regarded as more sacred than others because the divine fire burned brighter in their blood, because they stood closer to the gods in their very nature. And kingship itself was understood as a divine gift, passed down through these sacred bloodlines, with rulers claiming legitimacy not merely through conquest or wealth, but through their connection to the gods themselves, through the divine blood that flowed in their veins, and this concept of sacred bloodlines of certain families carrying special divine inheritance would become crucial for everything that followed. Because if some bloodlines were more divine than others, then the gods who had created humanity retained a special relationship with those particular lineages. And this relationship could be one of blessing and protection, but it could also be one of scrutiny and control, and potentially of punishment, when those bloodlines failed to fulfill their intended purpose. But then something changed, something catastrophic. The tablets tell us that the gods grew displeased with humanity, though the reasons given vary from text to text, and in one version, it is the noise of humanity that disturbs the gods, the clamour of our teeming multitudes that prevents Enlil from sleeping. And in another version, there are hints of humanity overstepping its bounds, of the creature becoming too numerous, too powerful, too independent for the comfort of its creators. And whatever the precise reason, the decision was made in the council of the gods to wipe the slate clean, to destroy humanity with a great flood and return the earth to silence. And this decision was supposed to be unanimous, supposed to be secret. But Enki, the wise one, the creator who had helped design humanity in the first place, could not bring himself to see his creation utterly destroyed. And so, in the middle of the night, he spoke not to a man directly, for that would have violated his oath, but to the reed wall of a hut, knowing that on the other side a righteous man was listening. And this man, whom the Sumerians called Ziusudra, and later traditions would call Utnapishtim, or Noah, received the warning and the instructions to build a great boat to gather his family and the seeds of all living things, and to seal himself inside and wait for the waters to come, and come they did, rising from the deep, bursting from the sky, flooding the earth, until only that single vessel remained floating alone on an endless sea, with the last remnants of the antediluvian world huddled within. And the flood represents the great division, the moment when everything changed, when the old world was washed away and a new world emerged, and when the waters finally receded, and Ziusudra emerged and made his offerings to the gods. Something fundamental had shifted in the relationship between heaven and earth, because the gods themselves were shaken by what they had done, by the destruction they had wrought. And there was regret and recrimination, and a determination that things would be different going forward. And one of the changes that the gods decreed was the limitation of human lifespans, because humanity would no longer live for thousands of years as they had before the flood, but would be constrained to a much shorter span, and the divine blood that flowed in human veins would be diluted generation by generation until mortality became our defining characteristic, and the gods themselves would withdraw from direct interaction with humanity, no longer walking among us as they once had, but ruling from a distance through intermediaries, through the priest kings who would govern in their name, and knowledge that had once been freely shared would now be closely guarded, passed down only through temple traditions and restricted texts. And this is where we find ourselves at a turning point in the story, because in the world after the flood, humanity was still connected to the gods. But that connection had become more distant, more mediated, more controlled. And the temples that rose in the cities of Sumer were not merely places of worship, but repositories of knowledge, archives, where the wisdom of the gods was preserved, but also regulated. And late at night, when the common people slept, the priests would unroll their tablets and study the secrets that had been passed down from the time before the flood. The knowledge that the gods had shared with humanity before the Great Separation. And among this knowledge were things that most people would never hear about. Mysteries of creation and destruction, secrets about the nature of humanity itself, and perhaps most intriguingly, information about those bloodlines that still carried stronger traces of divine inheritance, and what it meant to be part of such a lineage, and what the gods expected from those who bore their essence in their very blood. And we are left with a question that leads us deeper into the mystery. What else did the gods leave behind? What other knowledge was preserved in those temple archives? What secrets about humanity, about our design, about our vulnerabilities, might still be waiting in the clay tablets that have survived the millennia? And as we continue our journey, we will examine some of those tablets more closely, looking at what the ancient healers knew about disease, about heredity, about afflictions that seemed to follow certain families through generations, and asking whether their understanding might have roots that stretch back to the very beginning, to the gods who created us and who perhaps never entirely let go of their creation. In the narrow streets of ancient Nippur, where the evening light fell golden through gaps in mud brick walls, there lived those who understood the secret languages of illness and healing. The home of an Ashipu smelled of cedar smoke and dried herbs, of resins imported from distant lands, and oils pressed from plants whose names have long been forgotten. Here the exorcist healer worked in the soft glow of oil lamps, surrounded by tablets that contained the accumulated wisdom of generations, chanting words that had been spoken since the first cities rose from the fertile plains between the rivers. The Mesopotamians recognized that healing required two kinds of knowledge, and so they trained two kinds of healers to serve the people. The Asu was a practical physician who understood the body as a physical thing, and who knew which plants reduced fever and which poultices drew infection from wounds, who could set broken bones and stitch torn flesh with the careful precision of long experience. But the Ashipu served a different and perhaps more profound purpose. For this healer understood that some illnesses came not from spoiled food or contaminated water, but from sources beyond the visible world, from the displeasure of gods or the malice of demons, or the weight of sins committed by ancestors long dead. These two traditions worked together in ancient Mesopotamia, and the medical tablets that have survived reveal a sophisticated understanding of disease that combined careful observation with spiritual interpretation. The diagnostic texts are remarkably detailed, describing symptoms with a precision that would not be out of place in a modern medical handbook. If a patient suffers from fever and their eyes are yellow and their skin has taken on a similar hue, the tablets note, then the ailment affects the liver. If a patient cannot keep food in their stomach and experiences pain in the abdomen that comes in waves, the ancient physicians recognized the signs of intestinal distress. They recorded which diseases were contagious and advised isolation of the sick. They noted which conditions responded to herbal treatments and which required more elaborate intervention. But alongside these practical observations, the tablets also recorded something else, something that speaks to a deeper understanding of illness and its origins in the cosmic order. Actually, the Mesopotamians believed that disease could be sent by the gods as punishment, that demons could enter the body and cause suffering, that the sins of fathers could manifest as sickness in their children and their children's children. This was not mere superstition, but a coherent worldview in which the physical and spiritual realms were intimately connected, in which the body was a battleground where forces beyond human control fought for dominance. The Ashipu learned to read the signs, to determine through examination and divination whether an illness had natural causes or supernatural origins. And the answer to this question determined the course of treatment. Imagine now a family approaching the home of such a healer as the sun begins to set over the city. They carry with them a child who has grown weak over many months, whose skin has taken on an unhealthy pallor, whose energy has faded like a lamp running low on oil. The parents are frightened because they have seen this before. The child's grandmother suffered the same wasting illness. An uncle died young from similar symptoms. The sickness seems to run in the family like a dark thread woven through generations, and no amount of good food or clean water or careful living has been able to break its hold. The Ashipu listens carefully to their story, examines the child with gentle hands, and then reaches for the diagnostic tablets that line the walls of the treatment room. These tablets contain lists of symptoms and their meanings, organized with careful precision so that a trained healer could identify the source of almost any affliction. Some entries describe natural diseases and their herbal remedies, but other entries speak of something different, of illnesses that carry the signature of divine intervention, of conditions that are described as the hand of a specific god laid upon the sufferer. When an illness follows a family through generations, when it appears in parents and children and grandchildren with terrible predictability, the tablets suggest that this is not random misfortune, but targeted affliction. The hand of Shamash, the sun god, might strike those who had violated oaths or spoken false testimony, for Shamash was the god of justice who saw all that occurred under the light of day. The hand of Ishtar might fall upon families that had neglected her worship or violated the sacred laws of love and war over which she presided. The hand of Nergal, lord of the underworld and of pestilence, was particularly feared, for his touch brought diseases that consumed the body from within. But most significant for our exploration tonight are those passages that speak of afflictions sent by Enlil or Anu, or the Anunnaki themselves. Diseases that targeted not just individuals, but entire lineages. Conditions that followed the blood from generation to generation as though the blood itself had been marked. The Babylonians and Assyrians, who inherited and expanded upon Sumerian medical knowledge, used the phrase sharu sadam, which might be translated as the thing of blood, to describe conditions that passed from parent to child. They recognized patterns of inheritance that would not be scientifically explained for thousands of years. They saw that certain families were prone to particular conditions, while other families were spared. And they interpreted this observation through the lens of their understanding of the cosmos, concluding that such patterns must reflect the will of the gods who had created humanity and who retained power over human bodies and human fates. The medical tablets do not merely describe these hereditary conditions, but offer theories about their origins. Some texts suggest that the gods placed marks upon certain bloodlines at the time of creation, distinguishing between those who would serve different purposes in the divine plan. Other passages imply that hereditary diseases were punishments for ancient transgressions, curses laid upon ancestors that continued to manifest in their descendants. Still, other texts hint at something more disturbing, at the possibility that the gods deliberately designed certain weaknesses into specific human bloodlines, vulnerabilities that could be activated at will to bring suffering or death to targeted populations. These interpretations must be approached with appropriate scholarly caution, for the ancient languages are difficult and the tablets are often fragmentary, but the patterns in the texts are consistent enough to warrant serious attention. The people of ancient Mesopotamia did not merely accept these hereditary afflictions as inevitable fate. They developed elaborate rituals designed to break the chains of inherited illness, to purify bloodlines of the curses that plagued them, to negotiate with the gods for release from ancestral punishment. These rituals are preserved in collections known as the Namburbi texts, and they reveal just how seriously the ancients took the threat of bloodline-specific disease. The Namburbi rituals were complex ceremonies that could last for days, involving purification baths and special offerings, and the recitation of lengthy incantations that called upon the gods by their most sacred names. Some Namburbi were designed to avert specific predicted evils, to turn aside the bad fortune foretold by omens, but others were specifically targeted at hereditary conditions, at breaking the hold of illnesses that had plagued families for generations. These rituals often involved symbolic acts of separation, cutting the connection between the afflicted person and their diseased ancestry. The patient might be ritually reborn, passed through symbolic birth imagery to emerge as a new person, freed from the weight of inherited sin. Blood sacrifices were offered as substitutes, animals dying in place of human sufferers, their blood given to satisfy whatever divine requirement had originally mandated the affliction. In some cases, the rituals describe the creation of substitute figures, clay or wooden effigies that would take on the hereditary disease and then be destroyed or buried far from human habitation. The very existence of these elaborate rituals tells us something important about how the ancients understood hereditary disease. They did not see these conditions as natural inevitabilities, but as curses that could potentially be lifted, as divine punishments that might be commuted, as deliberate afflictions that had been imposed by specific beings for specific reasons, and could therefore be removed by appropriate spiritual intervention. This understanding implies a view of disease as intentional rather than random, as targeted rather than accidental, as meaningful rather than merely biological. And this brings us back to the gods themselves, to the Anunnaki, who, according to Sumerian mythology, created humanity, and who retained knowledge of human design that mortals could only dimly perceive. The god Enki, whom we encountered earlier in our journey, plays a particularly important role in these considerations. Enki was the god of wisdom and of the sweet underground waters, the lord of magic and crafts, and all forms of specialized knowledge. In the creation myths, it was Enki who conceived the plan to create humanity. Enki, who worked with the mother goddess Ninhursag to shape the first humans from clay mixed with divine blood. Enki, who breathed the breath of life into these creatures so that they might serve the gods and tend the earth. But Enki did not merely create humanity and then forget the details of his creation. The myths consistently portray him as retaining complete knowledge of how humans were made, of their physical structures and their vulnerabilities, of the divine components that animated their clay bodies, and the weaknesses that had been deliberately or accidentally incorporated into their design. In some texts, Enki appears as a healer god, teaching humanity the arts of medicine and magic that allowed them to combat disease. But in other passages, a different picture emerges, one in which Enki's knowledge could be used not only to heal, but to harm, not only to cure disease, but to create it. One Sumerian text describes a contest between Enki and Ninhursag, in which the mother goddess creates various disabled or afflicted humans and challenges Enki to find a place for each of them in society. This strange myth has been interpreted in many ways, but one reading suggests that it preserves memory of a time when the gods experimented with human design, creating variant forms with different characteristics and different vulnerabilities. Another text describes Enki creating 7 pairs of humans, each pair with different qualities and presumably different weaknesses. If the gods could create humans with specific characteristics, could they not also create or activate diseases that targeted those characteristics? If certain bloodlines carried more divine essence than others, are inherited from the time when gods and humans intermingled freely, could those divine markers not serve as targets for diseases designed to find them? The tablets do not answer these questions directly, for the Sumerian scribes were recording mythology and ritual practice rather than writing scientific treatises. But the implications that can be drawn from careful reading of these texts have troubled scholars and fascinated seekers for generations. The Mesopotamian understanding of disease was remarkably sophisticated, combining empirical observation with spiritual interpretation in ways that produced both practical medical treatments and profound philosophical frameworks for understanding human suffering. When we read their tablets today, we find descriptions of hereditary conditions that match our modern understanding of genetic diseases. We find recognition that some families were more susceptible to certain conditions than others. We find rituals designed to break these patterns of inheritance, to purify bloodlines, to free descendants from the curses of their ancestors. And woven through all of this, we find references to the gods who created humanity, who retained knowledge of human design, who had the power to afflict or heal according to their divine will. Whether we interpret these texts as mythology or history, or some strange combination of both, they preserve a vision of disease as purposeful and targeted, as something that could be directed at specific bloodlines for specific reasons. The Anunnaki, who came from heaven to earth, who created humanity to serve their purposes, who possessed knowledge that humans could only access through divine revelation, these beings had the means, and according to some readings of the texts, the motive to create diseases that killed only certain bloodlines. The tablets have preserved these troubling traditions across 5,000 years, waiting in museum collections and university archives for those willing to read them carefully and consider their implications. As the lamps burn low in our imagined Ashipu's home, and the sick child sleeps fitfully after the healing rituals have been performed, we are left with questions that the ancient scribes could not answer, and that we perhaps cannot answer either. But the questions themselves, preserved in wedge-shaped marks on tablets of clay, remind us that humans have always sensed that disease is not random, that some afflictions seem to choose their victims with terrible precision, that the blood which flows through our veins carries secrets we have only begun to understand. Consider for a moment the substance that moves through you right now as you listen to these words, that warm river flowing beneath your skin, pulsing with each beat of your heart, carrying oxygen and nutrients to every distant corner of your body. That ancient red tide that the Sumerians understood not merely as a biological fluid, but as something far more profound, something sacred, something that connected the mortal realm to the divine. Blood, to the people of ancient Mesopotamia, was not simply what kept a person alive, but rather the very essence of who that person was, the carrier of identity, of memory, of inheritance, of the spark that separated the living from the dead, and the human from the clay from which they were formed. When the great myths spoke of human creation, when the tablets described how Enki and the mother goddess Ninhursag fashioned the first humans to serve the gods, they spoke always of blood as the crucial ingredient, the divine component that transformed mere earth into breathing, thinking, feeling beings. In the Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest creation narratives we possess, the text describes how a god was slaughtered and his blood was mixed with clay. How from this sacred mingling humanity emerged, forever carrying within their veins a trace of the divine, forever connected to their celestial origins through this crimson inheritance. The Sumerians called this divine element the Atemu, or sometimes the Temu, and they believed it carried not just life force, but information, knowledge, memories that passed from generation to generation, like water flowing from mountain springs down to the sea. This was not metaphor to them, not poetry, but observable reality, for they could see with their own eyes how children resembled their parents, how certain talents ran in families, how particular weaknesses or strengths seemed to follow bloodlines through the centuries. And what else could explain this transmission but the blood itself, carrying its secrets from one generation to the next? Imagine yourself standing in ancient Ur, watching a royal procession pass through streets lined with reverent crowds, understanding as those ancient observers understood that the king who passes before you carries within his veins a higher concentration of divine blood than the common people who bow before him, that his bloodline stretches back through generations of sacred marriage between priests and priestesses who embodied the gods, back further still to those antediluvian times when the boundaries between heaven and earth were more permeable, when the Anunnaki walked openly among their creation and sometimes took human partners, creating lineages that would carry their essence forward through millennia. The Sumerian king list, that remarkable document that traces rulership back to before the flood, records not just names, but the extraordinary reign lengths of the earliest kings, tens of thousands of years for each ruler in those primordial times. Numbers that gradually decrease as history approaches more recent eras, and some scholars have interpreted this not as fantasy, but as a record of bloodline potency, the divine essence becoming diluted over generations until kings began to rule for merely human lifespans. Royal bloodlines throughout Mesopotamian history claimed direct descent from the gods, And this was not mere political propaganda, but a deeply held religious belief that shaped every aspect of society, determining who could enter certain temples, who could perform certain rituals, who could marry whom, and produce legitimate heirs to continue the sacred lineages. The blood of kings was different from the blood of commoners. The blood of priests carried its own distinct inheritance. And the tablets suggest that the gods who created humanity knew precisely what they had placed within each bloodline, understood the divine mathematics of inheritance in ways that humans could only dimly perceive. And here, we arrive at the unsettling implication that has been building throughout our journey this evening. For if certain bloodlines carried more divine essence than others, if the gods understood the mechanisms of inheritance with perfect clarity, then they possessed the knowledge necessary to target specific bloodlines, to create afflictions that would recognize the divine signature within certain families while passing harmlessly through others. This is what the medical texts seem to suggest when they speak of diseases that follow the blood, of curses that afflict generation after generation of a single family while leaving neighbors untouched, of diagnostic procedures that required the healer to trace a patient's ancestry before understanding what god or goddess might have laid this particular affliction upon them. The Namburbi rituals that sought to break hereditary curses would not have existed if hereditary curses were not understood to be real, if the Sumerians had not observed that some diseases, indeed, seem to choose their victims based not on behavior or exposure, but on something deeper, something written in the blood itself, something passed down from ancestors who had perhaps offended a deity in generations past, or who carried a bloodline that the gods had marked for a particular fate. But now, let us leave the ancient world for a time. Let our minds drift forward across the millennia, across the rise and fall of empires, across the long forgetting when the cuneiform tablets lay buried and their secrets were lost to human knowledge, forward to our own time, to the quiet hum of climate-controlled laboratories, where scientists peer at screens displaying the spiraling ladders of human DNA. Here, in these sterile rooms, researchers have mapped the human genome, the complete instruction manual written in 4 chemical letters, 3 billion base pairs that spell out everything about who we are, the color of our eyes, our predisposition to certain diseases, traces of ancestry that connect us to populations who lived thousands of years ago. And what they have discovered in these modern temples of knowledge carries strange echoes of what the Sumerians believed so long ago. For we now understand that diseases can indeed target specific bloodlines, that genetic variations common in certain populations can make them susceptible to conditions that rarely affect others, that the blood does carry information, though we call it genetic code rather than divine essence. Consider conditions like Tay-Sachs disease, which occurs predominantly in certain Ashkenazi Jewish and French-Canadian populations, or sickle cell trait, which developed as a protection against malaria, but can cause disease in those who inherit 2 copies of the variant gene, occurring most frequently in populations whose ancestors lived in malaria-endemic regions. Consider familial Mediterranean fever, which affects primarily people of Armenian, Turkish, Arab, and Jewish ancestry, or how certain cancer-causing mutations cluster in specific ethnic groups with particular historical patterns of intermarriage and genetic isolation. These are not curses laid by gods, modern science tells us, but the natural result of population genetics, of founder effects and genetic drift, of the way small populations can carry rare variants forward through generations. And yet, the parallel to what the Sumerians described is striking, for they too observed that certain afflictions followed certain families, that blood carried the information that determined susceptibility, that some lineages were marked for particular fates, while others were spared. We explain these phenomena through the mechanisms of molecular genetics, through mutations and inheritance patterns and population bottlenecks. But the ancient observers had no such framework available to them, and so they reached for the explanation that made sense within their worldview, that the gods who created humanity had engineered these specificities into the bloodlines from the beginning, or had added them later as blessings or punishments. The question that hovers between the ancient and modern explanations is how the Sumerians knew to look for these patterns at all, how they developed such sophisticated concepts of hereditary disease thousands of years before Mendel's peas or Watson and Crick's double helix, how their medical texts could describe afflictions that follow the blood with such precision if they were merely guessing or projecting supernatural explanations onto random events. Perhaps they were simply keen observers of the human condition, noticing across generations the way certain families seemed prone to certain illnesses. But the specificity of their rituals and the detail of their diagnostic categories suggest something more, a systematic understanding of hereditary disease that sits uncomfortably with our assumption that ancient peoples were scientifically naive. Some have proposed that the Sumerians preserved knowledge from an earlier civilization, that the Anunnaki of their myths were not supernatural beings, but representatives of an advanced culture who understood genetics in ways that were later lost and only recently rediscovered. And while this remains speculation, it offers one explanation for the uncanny resonance between ancient descriptions and modern discoveries. Others suggest that the human mind, even without modern instruments, can perceive patterns across generations, can develop intuitive understandings of inheritance that prove remarkably accurate even without a theoretical framework to support them. That the Sumerians were simply doing what humans do best, observing, categorizing, attempting to understand the world through whatever conceptual tools were available to them. Whatever explanation we prefer, the connection remains, a thread stretching across 5,000 years, linking the clay tablets of Nippur to the genome databases of the 21st century, linking ancient scribes who described the hand of the gods upon certain families to modern researchers who can now identify the specific genetic variants responsible for hereditary disease. But let us return now to the land between the rivers, not to the ancient past this time, but to the present day, unto Iraq as it exists now under the same sun that shone upon Ur and Uruk and Eridu, to the people who still live in the cradle of civilization, whose ancestors may have stood in the same temples where the tablets were first inscribed. The population of Mesopotamia has never been entirely replaced, despite all the invasions and empires that have swept across this land, despite the Arabs and the Persians and the Mongols and the Ottomans and the British. Despite all the violent disruptions of history, genetic studies show continuity, threads of ancestry stretching back thousands of years, connecting modern Iraqis and Syrians and Kuwaitis and Iranians to the peoples who first built cities and invented writing. These are not the same people, of course, for populations mix and migrate and change across millennia. But they are not entirely different people either. And somewhere in their genes may persist traces of the ancient bloodlines that the Sumerian scribes documented so carefully. When archaeologists excavate in Iraq today, when they carefully unearth clay tablets from the ruins of libraries destroyed by fire or flood or time, they do so under skies watched by people who carry within themselves some portion of ancient Mesopotamian inheritance, people whose blood remembers, in its chemical sequences, if not in conscious knowledge, the long history of this land. The marsh Arabs of southern Iraq, who until recently lived much as their ancestors lived for thousands of years, fishing and farming among the reed beds where the Tigris and Euphrates mingle before reaching the Persian Gulf, and may carry genetic lineages stretching back to the earliest Sumerian settlements. Their blood a living connection to the world we have been exploring tonight. And the knowledge, too, has not been entirely lost. For while the cuneiform script was forgotten for nearly 2,000 years, cultural memories persisted in folklore and religious practice, in stories passed down through generations that preserve echoes of the ancient myths even when their original context has been lost. Modern genetics has given us tools the ancients could never have imagined, the ability to read the information in blood with precision they could only have dreamed of, and yet we have not surpassed their essential insight that blood carries inheritance, that families are connected across time by something deeper than mere memory, that we are shaped by ancestors we never knew according to patterns established before our birth. The Sumerians attributed this to divine intervention, to the Anunnaki who created humanity and who retained the knowledge of their creation. And perhaps they were right in their own way. Perhaps they perceived a truth that we have merely translated into a different language, swapping gods for genes, curses for mutations, divine favor for advantageous adaptations. The tablets have given us questions that we cannot fully answer, mysteries that deepen rather than resolve, the more we learn about both ancient wisdom and modern science. And perhaps this is as it should be, for the universe is not obligated to make itself comprehensible to human minds, and some truths may lie beyond the reach of both ancient priests and modern researchers. What we can say with certainty is that the thread has not been broken, that the blood still flows, that the inheritance continues to pass from generation to generation, carrying its secrets forward into a future the Sumerians could not have imagined, and that somewhere in the chemical language of our genes may be written stories we have not yet learned to read, messages from our deepest past waiting to be deciphered by those who come after us. As you rest now, as your own blood moves quietly through your body, carrying its own inheritance, its own ancient information, consider that you too are connected to this long story, that the questions raised by the tablets of Mesopotamia are not merely academic puzzles, but touch upon the deepest mysteries of your own existence, who you are, where you came from, what has been written in your blood by ancestors stretching back through time beyond memory, beyond history, perhaps beyond humanity itself, into those primordial times when, if the tablets speak true, gods and men walked the earth together, and the boundaries between heaven and earth had not yet been firmly drawn. In the basement of the British Museum, where the air holds a particular stillness that seems to slow time itself, there are rows upon rows of wooden drawers, and within each drawer, wrapped in acid-free tissue and cushioned against the centuries, sit clay tablets that have not been read since the last scribe set down his stylus and walked away into a world that no longer exists. And this scene repeats itself in the Louvre in Berlin, in Philadelphia, in Baghdad, in Istanbul, in countless university collections and private archives around the world, where it is estimated that over 500,000 cuneiform tablets await translation, and perhaps only a fraction of those have been fully studied and published and understood. And within this vast ocean of unread words, there may rest passages that speak more directly to what we have explored tonight, and references that name the afflictions more precisely, that describe the mechanisms more clearly, that identify the bloodlines more specifically. But we cannot know, because the tablets wait in their drawers, patient as they have been for millennia, and the scholars who dedicate their lives to this work proceed slowly, carefully, methodically, because the clay demands respect, and the languages demand precision, and a single tablet might take months or years to fully understand and publish. And so the revelation of ancient knowledge comes not in dramatic bursts, but in the gentle accumulation of understanding, one fragment at a time, one word at a time, one connection at a time. And this is perhaps as it should be. For knowledge earned slowly is knowledge that transforms rather than merely informs. And we must approach these ancient voices with humility, acknowledging that we are students still, that our understanding of Sumerian thought and Akkadian medicine and Babylonian theology continues to evolve, that what seems certain today may be revised tomorrow as new tablets are read and new connections are made, and new scholars bring fresh perspectives to eternal questions. And somewhere in those unread tablets, there may be answers, or there may be only deeper questions, or there may be silences that speak louder than words. And we cannot know until the work continues, until the next generation of scholars takes up the stylus of interpretation and presses forward into the clay of the past. The sun is setting now over the land between the rivers, and the light turns golden, then amber, then deep, rose across the mounds that mark where Ur once stood, where Nippur once flourished, where Eridu rose from the primordial waters at the beginning of all things, and the Tigris and Euphrates continue their ancient journey as they have since. Before humanity walked their banks carrying the same water molecules, perhaps that once reflected the faces of Sumerian priests, gazing upward at stars they believed held the homes of the Anunnaki, and we must sit now with the questions we have raised together. For they are not questions that yield to easy answers, nor should they be for the deepest questions about human origins and divine intervention, and the mysteries of blood and inheritance and disease and design are questions that humanity has carried since we first became capable of wondering, and they are questions we will carry still when the last cuneiform scholar has completed the last translation. For these are the questions that make us human, and we have explored tonight the possibility that the Sumerians knew something about targeted affliction, about diseases that follow bloodlines, about divine knowledge of human biological design, and we have seen that the tablets do speak of illnesses attributed to specific gods that pass through families that require special rituals to break. And we have seen that modern genetics has revealed mechanisms by which diseases can indeed target specific populations, specific genetic markers, specific inheritances. And we must ask ourselves, what does it mean that the oldest written civilization on Earth recorded observations that seem to anticipate discoveries made only in our own time? And we must hold in tension the skepticism that protects us from credulity and the openness that allows us to learn from sources we do not fully understand. For the Sumerians were not primitive people playing with myths. They were the inventors of writing, the creators of the first cities, the developers of mathematics and astronomy and law and medicine. And when they recorded that certain afflictions came from the gods and targeted certain bloodlines, perhaps they were speaking in metaphor, or perhaps they were recording observations they could not explain, or perhaps they knew something we have forgotten, or perhaps they knew something we have not yet rediscovered. And the honest answer is that we do not know, and the honest response is to remain curious, to continue studying, to hold our conclusions lightly, and our questions closely for mythology is never merely fiction. It is the repository of a culture's deepest observations about the nature of reality encoded in story. Because story is how human beings have always transmitted their most important knowledge. And the Sumerians transmitted to us across 5,000 years a story about divine beings who created humanity, who possessed knowledge of human design, who could afflict and heal, who maintained interest in human bloodlines. And we are free to interpret this as pure imagination, or as garbled memory of actual events, or as symbolic truth expressing realities too large for literal language, or as some combination of all these possibilities. And the mystery remains, and the mystery is perhaps the gift. And now, let us rise above the rivers and the ruins above the clouds and the curve of the earth until we see our planet as the astronauts see it. A blue marble streaked with white, floating in the endless dark. And from this height, the Tigris and Euphrates are barely visible. Thin threads of silver in a brown and green tapestry, and the whole of Mesopotamia is just a small patch on a small world, orbiting a modest star in one arm of one galaxy among billions. And yet, on that small patch, something extraordinary happened. For the first time, beings made marks in clay that other beings could read thousands of years later. And through that miracle of writing, we have received messages from ancestors so distant that their bones have long since returned to the earth from which the tablets say we were made. And those messages speak of gods and creation, and blood and inheritance and affliction and healing. And they speak to us still if we have ears to hear and patience to listen and humility to learn. And perhaps tonight, as you drift toward sleep, you will carry with you the image of a scribe in ancient Sumer, pressing wedge shapes into wet clay, recording knowledge he believes is too important to trust to memory alone. And perhaps you will wonder what he knew and how he knew it, and whether the gods he served were metaphors or memories or visitors from the stars or something else entirely. Something we have no category for, something that waits in the clay for a future generation to discover and understand. And perhaps that is enough for tonight, to have wondered together, to have asked questions together, to have touched, however briefly, something ancient and strange and beautiful, and to rest now on knowing that the tablets will be there tomorrow, and the rivers will flow tomorrow, and the stars will wheel overhead tomorrow, and the mystery will remain tomorrow, patient and eternal, waiting for those who wish to continue the journey. And for now, let the ancient words settle into silence, and let the darkness be kind, and let the questions you carry be companions rather than burdens as you drift toward whatever dreams may come to you. Tonight, dreams perhaps of clay and stars and blood and memory, and the distant voices of those who first pressed meaning into earth and trusted that someone someday would hear them across the vast gulf of time. And you have heard them tonight. You have listened and wondered. And that is enough. And the tablets rest, and the rivers flow, and the stars turn. And you may rest now too, held in the same night that held the Sumerian scribes when their work was done. And they walked home through streets that have long since crumbled into the very earth from which they built their civilization. And sleep came to them as it comes to you, now gentle and inevitable, carrying them into the country of dreams, where perhaps all times exist at once, and all questions have answers, and all the separated threads of human wondering weave together into a pattern too vast and beautiful for waking eyes to see. And so, we leave you there on the threshold of that country with gratitude for your attention and your curiosity and your willingness to wonder about things that may never be fully known. And may you wake refreshed, and may the ancient ones walk with you in whatever way ancient ones walk with those who have taken time to listen to their long silenced voices speaking still from the clay that holds their words like a mother holds a sleeping child, precious and protected, waiting for the morning when they will speak again and again and again, for as long as there are those who wish to hear what the oldest voices have to say about where we came from and who we are, and why some among us carry burdens in the blood that others do not carry, and what all of this might mean in the vast unfolding story of humanity upon this small and ancient earth, beneath these eternal and indifferent stars. Good night.